Very soon, Europe will most likely face a severe food crisis, and America will face a deep political and social split. I do not want to scare you, but I do want to do something that is becoming extremely rare today. Call things by their real names, because the world is no longer entering a phase of isolated problems. It is entering a phase of cascading crises, where one breakdown triggers another. And if you want to understand why this is becoming almost inevitable, watch this video until the end. I have done my best to lay the whole picture out clearly for you. We are not going to comfort ourselves with pretty words. We are not going to pretend that these are just temporary difficulties that will somehow resolve on their own. No, we are going to look at reality coldly, at energy, at logistics, at food, at wars, at migration, at the degradation of political elites, at the weakness of societies themselves, and at how all of this is already beginning to form one large and very dangerous system. The problem is not one conflict and not one country. The problem is that the world has lived too long inside the illusion that the old order still works, that international institutions still control something, that politics is still capable of thinking strategically, that societies are still ready to unite in order to survive, rather than just argue, accuse, and wait for a savior. But that illusion is ending, and it is ending at a very high cost. There are four root causes behind what is happening. The first is the degradation of political elites. More and more of the world is being governed by short-sighted, greedy, weak, or simply inadequate people who do not solve crises, but postpone them, deepen them, and disguise them. The second is the unwillingness of ordinary people to take responsibility and truly unite. People may be angry, afraid, outraged, and full of blame, but very few are actually willing to organize, cooperate, and act together in a serious way. The third is the ecological crisis: polluted air, polluted water, polluted soil, microplastics, nanoplastics, environmental degradation, declining health, rising pressure on healthcare systems, and the general weakening of society. And the fourth is the climate crisis: heat, droughts, floods, storms, unstable weather, pressure on harvests, water systems, energy systems, and the cost of life itself. The most disturbing part is that the last two problems can no longer be solved properly, while the first two remain exactly as they are. As long as there is degradation at the top and fragmentation below, the world will not stabilize. It will keep sliding toward more expensive food, more expensive energy, weaker states, new waves of migration, fractured alliances, rising anger, and the collapse of ordinary everyday stability. That is why this video is not about abstract fear. It is about mechanism. It is about why one broken energy choke point can shake the entire world. It is about why a war in one place can trigger inflation, hunger, and migration in another. It is about why Europe is most likely entering a very harsh phase, why America is most likely heading toward an increasingly dangerous internal split, and why the old world no longer looks like a system that can simply return to its previous form. Now we are going to break all of this down step by step, without hysteria, without self-deception, and without the soft language that only puts people to sleep. And we will begin with one of the most dangerous choke points in the modern world, the Strait of Hormuz. And we will begin not with elections, not with moral judgments, and not with comforting talk about peace. We will begin with the Strait of Hormuz, because this is where you can see most clearly how much weaker the modern world really is than it likes to imagine. Most people still treat the war around Iran as just another regional conflict, another Middle Eastern clash that is unpleasant but supposedly concerns only those who live there. That is one of the biggest mistakes. The modern world is no longer built like a set of separate boxes, where one country burns and the others simply watch. It is built like a system of sensitive nodes. And when the right node breaks, The damage does not stay inside one country or even one region. It spreads through the whole structure. The Strait of Hormuz is not just a route for tankers. It is one of those places through which far too much of the world's stability passes. Before the war, roughly 20 million barrels of oil and oil products moved through it every day. After the war began on the 28th of February, those flows collapsed to a tiny fraction of their previous level. That is why the countries of the International Energy Agency moved toward the largest release of strategic oil reserves in history. When a system starts burning reserves on that scale, it is no longer just nervous. It is admitting that one of its central arteries has been hit. And this is where the main point begins. The problem is not only oil. It is not even only gas. The problem is that through places like this, the world does not simply move fuel. It moves predictability. And in the modern economy, predictability is worth almost as much as the resource itself. As long as tankers move, as long as insurers can calculate risk, as long as ships are not afraid, as long as sellers know their cargo will arrive, and as long as buyers know they will receive what they paid for, the system can keep functioning. It may be expensive, unfair, and tense, but it can function. The moment war enters the right location, with missiles, threats to vessels, strikes on infrastructure, insurance panic, and total uncertainty, it is not only trade that breaks. Confidence in tomorrow breaks with it. From there, the chain reaction becomes brutal and very easy to understand. First, oil becomes more expensive. Then gas becomes more expensive. Then electricity becomes more expensive. Then production costs rise. Then transport becomes more expensive. Then the whole logistics system becomes more expensive. From containers to trucks, from greenhouses to bakeries. And after that, the blow lands not on abstract markets, but on ordinary life itself, on food, on bills, on heating, on the price of everything people once treated as the background of normal existence. But even that is only the first layer of the udar. There is a second layer, and it is just as dangerous. That layer is fertilizer. Most people do not even follow the connection. They think that a war around Iran means oil, gasoline, gas, and geopolitics. But modern agriculture does not survive on land and rain alone. It depends on energy, gas, chemical inputs, logistics, and fertilizer. Around a third of global fertilizer trade moves through Hormuz. After the war began, prices for urea rose sharply. That means something very simple. The punch is not only landing on gas stations, it is landing on the future harvest. And that is what makes the situation truly dangerous. Crises almost never arrive in the way ordinary people imagine. People expect to wake up one day and suddenly find empty shelves. In reality, it starts much earlier. It starts the moment farming becomes more expensive. It starts when gas for fertilizer becomes more expensive. It starts when logistics begin to fail. It starts when deliveries arrive later, cost more, or come in reduced volume. It starts when the agricultural system begins to lose its margin of safety. And only after that, with a delay, does it become expensive food, shortages, nervous governments, protests, and migration. This is what modern collapse looks like. Not one dramatic apocalypse, but a chain reaction. The energy node breaks first, then the blow moves into industry, then into fertilizer, then into yields, then into food prices, then into weaker countries, then into politics, then into the stability of stronger countries too. That is why the Strait of Hormuz is not just another point on a map. It is a place where you can watch the whole world begin to come apart by layers. Now we have to ask the second hard question. How is the war around Iran most likely to end? And here we have to be honest. The most likely scenario is not a clean victory and not some magical regime change in Tehran. What is most likely is not a solution at all, but a dirty pause after mutual exhaustion. Israel prepared for a campaign of weeks, not for a full-scale ground occupation of Iran. That matters. It means the real goal was not total conquest, but the destruction of infrastructure, the elimination of parts of the command structure, and heavy pressure on Iran's nuclear, missile, energy, and symbolic resilience. But that does not mean the Iranian regime is likely to collapse. Quite the opposite. Even after major strikes on the leadership, intelligence assessments indicated that the regime remained broadly stable and was not on the edge of immediate breakdown. That is a harsh but important conclusion because it destroys the naive belief that if you remove the top figures, the whole system will simply fall apart. No. In authoritarian systems, especially systems like Iran, power does not rest on one face alone. It rests on layers. The religious apparatus, the security services, the Revolutionary Guard, the bureaucracy, the courts, the coercive machinery, the chain of succession, and the discipline of fear. So, even if part of the upper leadership is killed, that does not mean the country becomes ungovernable. In fact, it can produce the opposite effect. The regime may become weaker on the outside and harder on the inside. That is what is most likely to happen with Iran. Not a liberal awakening, not a rapid collapse, not a beautiful liberation, but a transition into a more militarized, more closed, more paranoid structure that relies even more directly on its coercive institutions. After the death of top figures, survival depends less on symbolic religious hierarchy and more on the Revolutionary Guard, the security apparatus, and the regime's ability to keep functioning under pressure. And this is where another point becomes essential. Even after the elimination of high-level leaders, control does not disappear. In systems like this, command is not only vertical, it is also distributed in a practical sense. Not democratic, of course, but distributed enough to survive. There are mid-level commanders. There are prearranged chains of command. There are reserve figures. There are duplicated institutions. There are autonomous centers of execution. That is exactly why Iran was still able to continue launching missiles, drones, and asymmetrical strikes against energy infrastructure and regional logistics, even after leadership losses. That is proof that decapitation is not the same as paralysis. And this is what makes the war around Iran even more dangerous. Because a weakened but unbroken Iran is not peace. It is a more unpredictable and more asymmetrical opponent. Such a regime no longer needs to look stable. It can shift toward inflicting pain. Pain for Israel, pain for Qatar, pain for the Gulf, pain for insurers, pain for Asian buyers of energy, pain for Europe through prices. That is why the strikes on Gulf infrastructure matter so much. When part of Qatari LNG capacity is knocked out and energy sites across the region are hit, this is no longer local revenge. It becomes an attempt to turn the cost of war into a cost for the whole world. Now we can say it even more sharply. This conflict is dangerous for the world, not only because Iran and Israel are fighting. It is dangerous because it strikes the right anatomy of the global system. The Gulf is energy. The Gulf is shipping routes. The Gulf is insurance. The Gulf is fertilizer. The Gulf is food imports for the region itself. And many people forget that the Gulf states are also vulnerable. They are wealthy, but heavily dependent on imported food and on energy-intensive desalination for water. If you hit such a region through energy, missiles, logistics, and fear, you do not damage one layer. You damage oil, gas, water, and food at the same time. That is not one problem. That is a cascade. So, the main conclusion of this part is clear. The war around Iran will most likely not end in a clean regime change, but in a dirty pause after severe mutual exhaustion. Iran will most likely not disappear, but it will emerge weaker, angrier, more closed, and more dependent on its power structures. Israel will most likely not achieve lasting strategic calm, but only weaken one major source of threat at the cost of a vast destabilizing effect across the region. And the rest of the world will already be paying for this through more expensive energy, more expensive food, weaker logistics, and more nervous politics. That is why Hormuz matters, not because a great deal of oil passes through it, but because too much stability passes through it. And when such a node breaks in wartime, it becomes more than a Middle Eastern story. It becomes the beginning of a long and vicious chain reaction. And after that, the next question naturally follows. If the world is already living in a way where rules are weakening, energy is becoming a weapon, and wars are hitting systemic choke points, then how much does this resemble the kind of world that once moved toward a great war in the past? Now, we arrive at one of the most uncomfortable questions in this entire picture. How much does what is happening now actually resemble the world before the Second World War? It is very important here not to slip into cheap hysteria. History never repeats itself literally. The world does not copy itself like a template. If someone says that today is exactly 1939 all over again, then they are either too lazy to think or too addicted to dramatic slogans. But there is something else, something far more dangerous. History often rhymes, not in exact text, but in logic, not in surface details, but in mechanisms. And if you look at the world honestly, without comforting illusions, the rhyme right now is deeply disturbing. Before the Second World War, the world did not wake up one morning and calmly announce that it had officially entered a great war. There were years of slow descent before that moment. Institutions weakened, distrust grew. Strong players kept testing how far they could go without paying a real price. Economic shocks pushed states toward hardness, nationalism, and a struggle over resources. Diplomacy still sounded elegant, but it was becoming weaker and less capable of restraining anything that truly mattered. That is exactly why the parallel feels so uncomfortable today, because the world is once again entering a phase where rules still exist on paper, but they are increasingly weak as real limits on power. If you look at the 1930s coldly, the danger did not come from one single factor. It came from several factors that fused into one dangerous system. There was economic destabilization. The Great Depression hit production, trade, employment, public trust, and political stability. When living standards collapse and fear about the future spreads, societies begin to think worse, not better. They become more vulnerable to simple answers, strong gestures, comforting myths, and political figures who promise restored greatness, restored safety, or at least a more emotionally satisfying version of reality. There was also the weakness of international institutions. The League of Nations still existed, but it failed exactly where it needed to restrain aggression. At the same time, military buildup intensified. And on top of that, many still believed that aggression could be softened, postponed, contained, or bought off through concessions. All of this together created a situation in which a great war stopped being an accident and started becoming a probability built into the system. Now look at what we see today. International institutions are weakening again, not because they have vanished, but because they are less and less capable of forcing major actors to obey the rules. The world has already reached a point where even the head of the World Trade Organization openly says that the old global order has changed irreversibly, and that trust and transparency between states have fallen so far that the rules based system increasingly looks like something states use only when it suits them. This matters because large systems do not collapse all at once. First, they lose authority. Then, they lose their ability to enforce. Then, they become a stage set. Only after that do people start asking in confusion why the old mechanisms no longer work. Arms control is weakening again, too. A new and dangerous arms race is already underway. The constraints are weaker, trust is lower, and the world is moving back toward a logic in which security is understood less as the ability to prevent collapse and more as the ability to intimidate, overwhelm, and force outcomes through pressure. This is not a minor warning sign. It is one of the darkest similarities with the world before the last Great War. Trade and economics are also becoming weapons again. This is another dangerous rhyme. Before a major war, the world did not crack only through armies and territorial grabs. It cracked through economic confrontation, protectionism, blocks, sanctions, and the struggle over markets, resources, and access to what societies needed to survive. Today, this pattern is returning in a more complex and technological form. Global forums now openly discuss fragmentation, geoeconomic confrontation, weaponized trade, disrupted supply chains, and the use of economic instruments as part of geopolitical conflict. In other words, the economic sphere is no longer just a background for politics. It is becoming one of the main battlefields. There is another parallel, and it may be even uglier. It is the condition of societies themselves. Before the Second World War, public consciousness was also vulnerable. People were exhausted by chaos, poverty, uncertainty, and elite failure. They wanted simplification. They wanted clear enemies. They wanted strength. They wanted a story that could make fear feel meaningful. Modern societies are not better in that respect. In some ways, they are worse. Because today, the old human vulnerability has been fused with information overload, algorithmic polarization, social media rage cycles, digital manipulation, and the slow destruction of any shared sense of reality. And this is where the present may actually be more dangerous than the past. Before the Second World War, the path toward a major conflict was more direct. There were armies, occupations, clearer blocks, and visible territorial ambitions. Today, the world can move into a new global war without one obvious moment when it is officially declared. It can be assembled through separate crises that connect into one larger process. Through Hormuz, through Ukraine, through the Red Sea, through Taiwan, through cyber conflict, through sanctions, through semiconductors, through energy choke points, through the collapse of trust, through migration and food pressure. The next world war may not look like one giant front line. It may look like a network of connected breakdowns that together form a state of global confrontation. That is exactly the part most people still fail to feel. They think that if there is no formal declaration, if there are no tank columns moving across every border at once, if there is no single clean division of the world into two military camps, then a world war is not happening. That way of thinking belongs to another era. The modern world is more interconnected and more vulnerable than the world of the past. One blow to energy raises prices everywhere. One disruption in logistics affects food in another region. One conflict at sea reshapes insurance, shipping, and trade routes. One crisis in a major state produces new waves of populism and radicalization elsewhere. Step by step, the world enters a distributed form of war, in which the fronts are different, but the system of pain is shared. That is why I am not only talking about the risk of a third world war in the classical sense. I am talking about the risk of a distributed third world war. Not in the old cinematic meaning, but in the real modern one. A world where some actors fight with missiles, others with sanctions, others with oil, others with logistics, others with chips, others with disinformation, and still others simply by exploiting the internal weakness of their rivals. If you look at the world in that way, you begin to see that we are already dangerously close to a phase in which peacetime remains mostly a legal formula, not a lived reality. There is another disturbing rhyme with the 1930s. Back then, many people believed everything could still be handled later. They believed the danger could be softened, delayed, or managed through caution and concessions. That logic of appeasement has returned in a more modern form. Too many players still hope that if they avoid naming the danger clearly, if they keep patching consequences instead of confronting causes, If they pretend the old normal can somehow come back, then the system can still be stretched a little longer. But the old world is not returning, it is shedding its shape. And the longer people refuse to see that, the more painful the next stage will be. At the same time, I am not saying that everything will unfold exactly as it did before. That matters. If we turn analysis into lazy drama, we make ourselves weaker. I am not saying tomorrow is literally 1939 again. I am saying something else. We are once again living in an age in which international institutions are weaker. Arms races are intensifying. Trust is collapsing. Trade is becoming a weapon. Major powers are testing limits more openly. Societies are growing more frightened, more exhausted, and more irrational under pressure, and elites are becoming less capable of thinking in terms of long-term systemic stability. That is the dangerous rhyme. So the greatest mistake today is to look at each crisis separately. Iran by itself, Ukraine by itself, China by itself, the United States by itself, migration by itself, climate by itself, markets by themselves. No, these are no longer separate lines. They are parts of one larger process, in which the old world order can no longer hold the system together as it once did, while the new order has not yet taken shape. And in exactly these periods, in the space between the old order and the new one, history becomes most dangerous, because in such periods states start thinking first about survival and advantage. Alliances weaken or are rebuilt on pragmatic terms. Rules bend under pressure. Societies become angrier. Politics becomes rougher. Decisions are made not in the logic of long-term stability, but in the logic of immediate gain. The world begins to live not for the future, but for short-term rescue at any cost. And that is usually the sign that the system has already entered a truly dangerous phase. So the main question is no longer whether things can get worse. The real question is which scenarios over the next 3 years are most likely, where the world may still hold together, where it may begin to unravel faster, and what the best bad scenario, the most likely scenario, and the worst realistic scenario actually look like. That is exactly where we are going next. Now we come to the part most people are actually waiting for. What happens next? Not in an abstract way. Not in the lazy style of saying that anything is possible. Not in the cheap language of fear, where someone piles up anxiety and then disappears into vagueness. I mean cold scenarios, because the world has already reached the point where naivete is more dangerous than panic. If people keep pretending that everything will somehow settle down on its own, they may simply fail to notice the moment when the old reality is already gone. If we look honestly, the next 3 years do not contain an infinite number of meaningful paths. There are many variations in detail, but in terms of real structure, they can be reduced to three major scenarios. One is the best of the bad. One is the middle path, and that is the one that most likely comes closest to reality. And one is the worst of the realistic scenarios. The best of the bad does not mean the world returns to normal. It only means the system avoids the harshest cascading collapse and enters a long phase of expensive, tense, but still partially manageable instability. In that version, the war around Iran does not end with a clean peace, but neither does it turn into a permanent regional explosion that tears the entire Middle East apart. It freezes, or slips into a dirty pause, where the sides are too exhausted to escalate further at full pace. The Strait of Hormuz partially recovers. Fear remains on the markets, but it does not become a full structural breakdown of global energy. Prices for oil, gas, food, and fertilizer stay high, but they do not spiral into completely uncontrolled acceleration. Europe does not collapse, but it becomes poorer, angrier, and more defensive. Ukraine remains under immense strain, but avoids a full internal breakdown. Russia keeps pressing, but fails to achieve a decisive strategic breakthrough. The United States continues to fracture internally, but does not yet cross into open systemic rupture. China strengthens itself, watches, adjusts, and benefits from the weakness of others, but avoids one reckless direct move that could ignite the whole region at once. In that scenario, the world does not break in one dramatic moment, but life becomes harder almost everywhere. Energy is more expensive. Food is more expensive. Security is more expensive. Anxiety grows. Anger grows. Migration grows. Trust declines. The sense that someone still controls the situation declines with it. This is not apocalypse, but it is no longer a normal world either. It is a world living on nerves, on reserves, and on the constant awareness that the next blow may come from almost any direction. The most likely scenario is worse, not because it looks more cinematic, but because it is stickier and more corrosive. In this version, crises do not simply continue in parallel, they begin to reinforce each other more directly. The Middle East remains unstable for longer. Hormuz does not return to its previous normal condition. The energy shock does not disappear quickly, but settles into the system as a new structural cost of living. Oil, gas, fertilizer, and logistics stay expensive long enough to change the behavior of states, businesses, and societies. In some countries, food systems begin to weaken more seriously. In some places, there is not enough money for imports. In others, fertilizer prices strike agriculture from the inside. In others, climate instability amplifies what was already fragile. That is when the next layer begins: food stress, shortages, more frightened governments, unrest, and a new wave of large scale migration. In Europe, this scenario means more than simple economic pain. It means deeper political stress. Each state begins to look inward even more. The broader idea of the European Union weakens under the pressure of survival. As long as things are relatively stable, it is easy to speak in the language of values, solidarity, and shared responsibility. But when expensive energy, expensive food, fear of migration, military pressure, internal populism, and social anger all arrive together, many states begin to act less like parts of a strategic bloc and more like separate actors trying to save their own systems first. That is exactly how large unions begin to crack from within. Ukraine, in this middle scenario, continues to live in a state of severe endurance. Not triumph, not total collapse, endurance. The war goes on. Energy remains vulnerable. Fuel, logistics, and daily life become heavier burdens. Society keeps tiring. Military, economic, and demographic losses continue to accumulate. This does not necessarily mean immediate implosion, but it creates a reality in which every difficult winter, every external shock, and every disruption in supply becomes more painful than the last. Russia, in this scenario, does not truly win, but it does not retreat into peace either. It continues the war because war has become embedded in the logic of the regime itself. At the same time, it continues hybrid pressure on Europe, not only through its military, but through sabotage, disinformation, coercion, social fragmentation, and exploitation of weak points in energy, logistics, and politics. So even where the front line itself does not move dramatically, the general level of danger for Europe remains high. The United States, in this scenario, enters an even more toxic phase of internal conflict. The main risk is not tanks in the streets tomorrow. The main risk is that the political system becomes less and less capable of processing its own polarization. The deeper the internal split becomes, the weaker the country becomes as an anchor of broader global stability. And when a state of that size begins to drown in mutual hatred, institutional distrust, elite conflict, and exhaustion with shared reality itself, the consequences spill far beyond its borders. China, in this scenario, does not need to begin a huge war in order to deepen the crisis. It only needs to exploit weakness. It only needs to increase pressure. It only needs to reshape trade, technology, and political dependencies in a world where old centers of power are too busy containing fires to think clearly about the future. That is exactly what makes China so strategically dangerous in this period. It can become one of the greatest beneficiaries of global weakening without making one single, obviously catastrophic move. That is why the middle scenario is the ugliest one. Not because it is spectacular, but because it is slow. It doesn't strike once, it erodes. People tire slowly, states weaken slowly, markets degrade slowly, democracies rot slowly, alliances fray slowly. And because all of this happens gradually, many people keep telling themselves they are still living inside a temporary crisis, when in fact, they are already inside a harder new normal. Now, the worst realistic scenario. This is not the end of the world in a cinematic sense, but it is the version in which crises stop merely overlapping and begin actively accelerating one another. Hormuz remains effectively broken for a long time. The Red Sea remains unsafe. The energy shock stops looking temporary and becomes a long structural burden. Fertilizer remains expensive and unstable. In weaker countries, and even in some middle tier states, yields decline more seriously, sometimes because of price, sometimes because of climate, sometimes because of logistics, sometimes because of all of it at once. Food prices do not simply become unpleasant, they become destructive for millions. Protests deepen, internal ruptures spread, panic grows, radicalization accelerates, new migration waves break loose. Europe enters a hard social and energy phase. Ukraine moves into a condition of near maximum exhaustion. The United States drifts toward a much more dangerous internal confrontation. And China concludes that the weakness of others is now deep enough to justify far more aggressive strategic pressure. That is the point at which the world stops looking like a severe crisis and begins to look like a distributed global war. Not necessarily with one official declaration, not necessarily with one clean historical date that future textbooks can circle, but with all the real signs of such a war: multiple conflict zones, multiple blocks of interest, energy used as a weapon, food used as a destabilizing force, migration used as pressure, technology treated as a critical vulnerability, information warfare everywhere, and governments that think less and less about development and more about survival at any cost. This is the moment where it becomes necessary to say something very clearly. A classical Third World War in the old mass imagination, with formal blocks, direct simultaneous collision between the biggest powers, and total open mobilization, still does not look like the most likely scenario of the immediate future. But a distributed world war, in which the planet is already burning across multiple lines at once, in which states strike each other through energy, logistics, markets, perception, and social instability, is no longer a fantasy. It is already becoming a model of reality. That is why the real question today is not simply whether catastrophe will happen or not. That question is too primitive. The better question is how deep the break will go, where it will hit first, who will be least prepared for it, and which parts of the old world will still exist after the next 3 years in anything resembling their current form. And in order to understand that, we now have to move from general scenarios to specific regions, because the world will not break evenly. Some places will experience expensive and angry instability. Others will move into real survival conditions. Some will face political fragmentation. Others will harden into even more dangerous sources of exported chaos. And that is why the next step has to be Europe, Ukraine, and Russia, because that region will remain one of the central zones of severe instability in the years ahead. Europe is not likely to enter mass famine as its baseline condition, but that should not calm anyone down. There is a wide and very ugly range between mass famine and normal life, and that is exactly where Europe is moving. It is moving into a world of expensive food, expensive energy, expensive logistics, expensive heating, expensive industry, expensive credit, and increasingly vicious domestic politics. In other words, not famine in the old cinematic sense, but a harsh crisis in the cost of ordinary life itself. The most dangerous part is that Europe lived too long inside the illusion that its wealth, institutions, infrastructure, and alliance system made it fundamentally protected. Part of that was true. Europe is still richer and more resilient than many other regions. But a wealthy system is not the same thing as an invulnerable system. In fact, the more complex and expensive a system is, the more hidden points of fragility it contains. And those weak points are now becoming more visible. The fact that the European Union is already discussing emergency tax cuts, subsidies, and temporary measures simply to soften the blow from the war around Iran tells you everything. The system is no longer comfortably functioning. It is already in firefighting mode. It is no longer thinking first about development. It is thinking about how to keep internal pressure from turning into open destabilization. When a large political bloc starts focusing not on strategy, but on how to contain electricity bills, industrial stress, and social anger, that means the crisis is already inside the structure, not outside it. It is also important to understand that Europe will not suffer evenly. Continents never break evenly in periods like this. They crack along their weak lines. The most vulnerable countries and regions are the ones that are less protected in terms of energy logistics, more dependent on external fuel, less connected to maritime routes, and more politically exposed to supply disruption. That is why Central Europe looks especially fragile. Countries that depend more heavily on external flows and have less room for energy maneuver are likely to feel this pressure faster and harder. Hungary and Slovakia have already shown how sensitive this is. Their political behavior is increasingly tied to fuel flows, and Budapest has openly linked its actions to the restoration of Druzhba-related supply logic. That is not just a technical disagreement. It is a preview of how Europe behaves under hard stress. It stops speaking mainly in the language of solidarity and starts speaking in the language of routes, ports, pipelines, tankers, and self-preservation. And that is one of the main threats to the European Union. Not necessarily a formal collapse tomorrow, but a slow internal loosening of discipline, trust, and shared burden. As long as life is tolerable, it is easy to talk about values, unity, and common responsibility. But once expensive energy, expensive food, fear of migration, military pressure, internal populism, and social anger start accumulating, every state begins calculating for itself. That is how large blocs start to crack. First informally, then politically, then economically. So if we speak plainly, Europe is unlikely to die of famine as a continent, but it is highly likely to enter a period in which normal life becomes noticeably less affordable for millions of people. This means dearer food, dearer energy, weaker growth, harsher politics, and a much more expensive model of stability. And if the energy shock lasts, then the risks of local restrictions, partial disruptions, industrial slowdown, and rolling stress across power systems become far more real, especially in winter. Now, Ukraine. For Ukraine, everything will be much harsher, and there is no point softening the language here. Ukraine is already living under the combined pressure of war, energy stress, fuel dependence, worn out infrastructure, demographic exhaustion, hard internal mobilization, and fragile logistics. This means the country is not just under pressure. It is in a state of accumulated strain, where every new external blow hits harder than the previous one. Even on the fuel level, the danger is obvious. There were warnings that diesel supplies were sufficient only for the immediate period, while the outlook for the following weeks looked increasingly uncertain. Other analysts pushed back against the sharpest versions of that claim, but that is not the main point. The real point is that such discussions became normal in the first place. That alone shows how exposed and nervous the supply system has become. And even where there is disagreement over how immediate the shortage risk is, there is no real disagreement about the deeper fact. Ukraine remains highly vulnerable to fuel, logistics, and energy disruptions, and any new deterioration in the region hits it particularly hard. If weak harvest conditions are added to expensive fertilizer, expensive energy, and a severe winter, then the period from late 2026 onward can become brutally difficult, not as the literal end of the state, but as a very harsh survival regime in which electricity, heat, transport, supply, and ordinary daily stability begin to look like luxuries rather than normal background conditions. That is what makes this so dangerous. Frontline war does not always destroy a country immediately. Long-term damage to the rear destroys resilience more slowly, but often more reliably. At the same time, there is another side to this. If Ukraine survives this phase, if it avoids full internal breakdown, if it keeps enough people, infrastructure, and institutional continuity to endure, then later those same territories may become more attractive, not less attractive, for reconstruction, capital, infrastructure rebuilding, agriculture, and logistics redesign. But that comes later. Before that comes a deep fall. That is why the most important resource for ordinary people inside Ukraine is not only money and not only the state. It is the ability to form horizontal ties, maintain autonomy in food, water, heat, medicine, documents, and communication, and rely on real human networks when large systems start functioning worse. Now, Russia. One of the most dangerous illusions in Europe is the belief that if the hottest phase of the war in Ukraine weakens, Russia will somehow become calmer or safer. That is deeply naive. Even if the intensity of the front line changes, Russia is highly likely to remain a generator of chaos for Europe for years to come. And the danger here is not only military. The danger lies in the logic of the regime itself. Russia has now woven war too deeply into its political and psychological structure. This is no longer just one conflict among many. It is a way of explaining the world, a way of holding the vertical together, a way of mobilizing loyalty, a way of distributing fear, a way of governing through the image of an external and internal enemy. A regime that has lived inside that logic for years does not simply return to normality by instinct, especially not if large numbers of men, shaped by war, violence, militarized thinking, and the normalization of force, eventually return to a society that cannot properly absorb them. That is why the most likely danger is not an immediate tank march into Europe, but the continued export of chaos in hybrid form. Sabotage, arson, disinformation, social fragmentation, pressure on weak points in energy systems, logistics chains, and political institutions. Western analysis is already very clear on this. However the war ends, Russia is likely to emerge more embittered, less secure, and more dangerous to Europe than it was before 2022. That means one crucial thing. A reduction in battlefield intensity is not the same as a reduction in threat. It simply means the threat changes form. The Russian economy is not invulnerable either. The war model allows it to continue for a long time, but not for free. The burden on labor, the budget, the civilian sphere, and the long-term social balance keeps growing. And if the regime eventually has to deal with large numbers of war-shaped men returning into a strained internal system, there will be strong pressure to redirect that violence outward rather than heal it inward. Authoritarian systems are very bad at demobilizing aggression. They are much better at exporting it. So the overall picture is harsh but clear. Europe is moving toward expensive and angry stability near the edge of a severe crisis. Ukraine is moving toward a much harder phase of endurance, where war, energy stress, and the breakdown of ordinary life fuse into a long survival struggle. Russia is unlikely to become a factor of peace, and much more likely to remain a factor of prolonged disorder. And that means something deeply unpleasant. Even if the world becomes a little quieter on the surface, the danger will not disappear. It will simply move from the front line into energy, politics, sabotage, and long term exhaustion. And that is why the next part matters just as much. Because now we have to look at another massive contour of instability: the United States and Asia, and the way America's internal fracture and Asia's resource vulnerability may become the next accelerant of the global crisis. Now we move to two more massive contours of instability, without which the overall picture remains incomplete. Because if Europe, Ukraine, and Russia form one heavy knot in the global breakdown, then the United States and Asia form another. And the danger here is that these two zones are destabilizing in very different ways, yet both can intensify the same global crisis. Let us begin with the United States. In the coming years, the main risk for America is not mass hunger, not empty shelves, and not the overnight disappearance of the state. The main risk is a deep political and social fracture that can go so far that the country stops functioning as a stable center of power and starts acting as a giant source of internal instability with global consequences. And here we need to speak plainly. The strength of a state is not only its army, not only its money, and not only its flag. The strength of a state is also its ability to maintain at least some shared reality, some shared rules, some line beyond which politics does not turn into a war of everyone against everyone. And that exact part of the American system is beginning to look increasingly fragile. For a long time, America rested not only on its economy and military, but also on the image of a country where, despite conflict, there was still a frame, still institutions, still some limit to how far internal destruction could go. But that sense of a common frame is weakening. Political camps hate each other more deeply. The information space has long ceased to be a space of discussion. It has become a battlefield of mutual hostility. Trust in elections, in media, in institutions, and even in the idea of neutral facts is eroding. And when a society no longer believes in reality as something shared, it stops living as one country and starts living as several parallel worlds that barely recognize one another as legitimate. That is the most dangerous point, because a fractured America is dangerous not only to itself, it is dangerous to the entire system around it. As long as the United States remains at least relatively coherent, it can still function as an external anchor. Cynical, perhaps, inconsistent, perhaps, but still an anchor. But if a country of that scale enters a phase of deep internal rupture, it stops acting as a stabilizer and begins generating additional chaos on its own. In the years ahead, the United States is likely to face not one crisis, but several at once: political hatred, economic stress, declining trust in institutions, information warfare, radicalization at the edges, exhaustion with the old political system, growing intolerance between camps. All of this makes the later electoral cycle especially dangerous, not because one year automatically guarantees collapse, but because by that point, enough irritation, distrust, and accumulated symbolic violence may exist for the political crisis to begin functioning as an almost systemic threat. It is important to understand that countries rarely break because of one factor. They break when several pressures arrive at once. The United States can remain extremely rich, heavily armed, and globally influential while becoming internally less stable. That is the paradox. External strength can continue to exist while the social fabric inside begins to fray. And there is another ugly part. Under conditions of deep polarization, elites themselves begin to play dirtier. Instead of calming society, they increasingly mobilize it through fear, resentment, simplification, and internal enemies. This is particularly dangerous because once elites begin feeding on division, they are no longer motivated to heal it. They are motivated to manage it for short term gain. And internal division, like war, is easy to exploit in the short term and extremely difficult to shut down once it becomes normalized. So the baseline risk for the United States is not that it simply disappears. The risk is that it enters a poisonous phase where internal political conflict begins to function almost like a domestic front line of the global crisis. That may appear through waves of internal violence, institutional paralysis, radicalization across states and regions, conflict between the federal center and political blocs, or growing disputes over the legitimacy of power itself. It does not have to look like a classic civil war in order to become structurally dangerous. It only has to move far enough into a condition where the country increasingly lives near the edge of institutional failure. And why does this matter to everyone else? Because a United States in deep internal conflict is less capable of holding together the wider system, less capable of acting predictably, less capable of functioning as a center of strategic continuity. And if that happens, while Europe enters expensive instability, Russia continues exporting chaos, and the Middle East keeps striking at energy and logistics, then American weakness stops being an American problem. It becomes an accelerant of global disorder. Now let us turn to Asia. And here, most people make another serious mistake. They are used to viewing Asia either as a permanent engine of growth or as a future battlefield around Taiwan. But Asia is more complicated than that. It is both one of the main engines of the world and one of the most vulnerable parts of the global system. The key point is simple. If Europe suffers mainly through prices when Hormuz is damaged for a long time, Asia suffers through both prices and physical pressure on supply. The main flows of oil and liquefied natural gas moving through Hormuz are directed toward Asia. That means that if this choke point remains unstable for long enough, Asia does not only face expensive energy, it faces real risks to industrial rhythm, production loading, transportation, and the broader continuity of its economic machine. And here we need to separate China and India because they represent two different forms of vulnerability. China looks stronger, and in some ways, it is stronger. It has more reserves, more industrial density, more strategic depth, more internal control, and more capacity to redistribute shock across the system. But that is exactly why China is vulnerable, not in the form of sudden collapse, but in the form of slow, dangerous deterioration. An enormous industrial machine requires enormous energy, enormous logistics, enormous raw material flows, and enormous external market stability. As the world begins living under expensive energy, weaker trade, unstable routes, and climate pressure, China takes a hit not in one place, but across the architecture of its growth model. At the same time, China does not appear eager to ignite everything at once. Its strength lies in waiting, consolidating, and benefiting from the weakness of others. But that does not mean it is calm. On the contrary, the weaker the rest of the world becomes, the greater the temptation for China to move toward harder bargaining, harder pressure, and a more aggressive strategic posture. That is what makes China not only an object of risk, but a potential multiplier of it. It doesn't need to launch a massive war to make the world more unstable. It only needs to use the exhaustion and fragmentation of others to push harder around Taiwan, around trade, around technology, and around the regional order. And that brings us to Taiwan. Taiwan is not just an island. It is one of the most critical nerves in the modern technological system. If the Middle East can break the world through oil, gas, and shipping, then Taiwan can break it through chips, electronics, manufacturing, and the future infrastructure of advanced industry. And for that to happen, a full-scale invasion is not even necessary. Long-term pressure, blockade threats, fear in the markets, and disruption in supply expectations may already be enough to create a major technological shock. In that case, the world receives a second kind of structural blow, not directly through food and fuel, but through production, technology, and the nervous system of modern complexity itself. Now, India. If China is vulnerable through scale and complexity, then India is vulnerable through the combination of enormous population, energy dependence, food pressure, and climate brutality. And that is a very dangerous combination. India is not simply a large country. It is an enormous human mass that, under conditions of heat, expensive energy, gas problems, food stress, and infrastructure weakness, can quickly become not just a driver of growth, but a major source of instability. The climate dimension matters especially here, because India is one of the clearest examples of how climate pressure works not as an abstract moral issue, but as a direct, destabilizing force. Heat, pressure on harvests, pressure on water, pressure on electricity, pressure on cities, pressure on social peace. And if this is layered on top of expensive energy and supply strain, the result can become severe. Not because India is somehow weak in a simple sense, but because even very large countries become vulnerable when several shocks arrive at the same time. And here we return again to ecology and climate, not as decorative themes, but as real amplifiers of geopolitical crisis. Many people still think in separate compartments: politics first, wars separately, economics separately, climate separately. But that model is dead. Ecological degradation weakens human health. It weakens soil. It weakens water. It increases the burden on medicine. It reduces the resilience of whole systems. Climate instability strikes harvests, water, electricity, cities, and the basic cost of survival. The energy crisis strikes fertilizers, industry, and logistics. And then all of this together begins to turn into expensive food, poverty, anger, migration, radicalization, and internal political breakdown. That is the ugliest formula of the modern world. The real danger is not isolated crises. The real danger is the way they begin to reinforce each other. If China starts to stall, the world feels it through production. If India takes simultaneous hits through energy, climate, and food pressure, the world gains another enormous center of instability. If the United States falls deeper into internal fracture, the world loses one of the old strategic anchors. If Europe drifts into expensive and angry instability, alliance discipline weakens. If the Middle East keeps hitting energy and shipping, everyone else pays more and grows weaker. In other words, the question is no longer whether there is one central crisis. The world has already entered a phase in which several crises are functioning as one system of mutual acceleration. And that is why it no longer makes sense to look at America separately from Asia, Asia separately from Hormuz, Hormuz separately from food, food separately from climate, or climate separately from politics. Everything is tied together, and the longer this lasts, the more painfully it will be felt, not in analysis, but in everyday life. Which brings us to the next and most unpleasant conclusion. What is likely to happen to the very shape of the world itself? Which alliances begin to crack? Which states move toward autonomy? Why mass poverty will spread almost everywhere? Why the old framework of law, markets, and ordinary life starts to weaken? And what, if anything, will remain of the familiar order if these processes continue without being stopped? And now we arrive at the deepest level of this entire discussion. Not what happens to one country, not what happens to one conflict, but what happens to the very form of the world itself. Because the main risk of the coming years is not only expensive energy, not only hungry regions, not only wars, and not only migration. The main risk is that the familiar frame of the world is beginning to lose its shape. Not all at once, not on one dramatic day, not with a formal declaration, but slowly, unpleasantly, and along many lines at the same time. So this needs to be said directly. In the coming years, some states will very likely remain physically on the map, yet cease to exist in the political, social, and economic form in which people know them today. That does not necessarily mean the disappearance of a flag, the erasure of borders, or an official breakup into pieces. A state often stops being itself long before anyone openly admits that it has changed. It can keep all the external signs of normal statehood: a parliament, a government, laws, a currency, borders, bureaucracy, official speeches, and still begin to live by a completely different logic inside: a logic of survival, deficit, permanent crisis management, anxious mobilization, internal fragmentation, and weakening institutions. That is how historical turning points usually work. People keep telling themselves that the state is still the same, because the facade is still standing, the emblem is still there, and the news still follows a familiar format. But inside, everything is already operating differently. The old stability is gone. The old trust is gone. The old reserve of strength is gone. The old confidence in tomorrow is gone. What remains is a system trying to hold itself together while sacrificing quality of life, the future, freedom, law, and long term resilience simply to avoid collapsing right now. That is the phase the world is now entering. From here, many countries are likely to move either toward greater autonomy or toward new alliances built not on beautiful principles but on naked mutual benefit. And this may be one of the most important shifts of the coming years. The old world loved pretending that large unions existed on the basis of shared values, historical solidarity, rules, and elevated ideas. In practice, that was never entirely true. But the rhetoric still worked, and the system still held. Now there is less and less of that. In a world of expensive energy, expensive food, expensive logistics, and steadily weakening international rules, states begin to react in a very simple way. They try to save themselves first. That means the coming years are likely to bring not the expansion of idealistic blocs, but the strengthening of colder, more pragmatic arrangements. Not we are together because we share a higher destiny, but we are together because we need the same route, the same port, the same gas, the same market, the same shield, or the same method of surviving the crisis. In other words, the map of alliances becomes more nervous, less moral, and more cynical. And this is not a temporary distortion. It increasingly looks like the beginning of a new norm. Against that background, the internal fracture of the European Union stops being a fantasy or a favorite scare story of skeptics and becomes a real structural risk. It is important to say this precisely. This does not necessarily mean that the European Union formally collapses tomorrow and everyone walks away at once. It means that the bloc may increasingly lose internal cohesion, internal discipline, and internal willingness to carry a common burden. Why does that happen? Because large unions remain strong only as long as the basic benefit of staying together exceeds the cost of internal tension. As long as markets work, energy remains accessible, food remains relatively affordable, industry keeps breathing, and the public is not enraged by falling living standards. But when expensive energy, expensive food, fear of migration, military pressure, internal populism, fatigue from supporting weaker neighbors, and rising domestic anger all arrive at once, every country begins to calculate differently. How much solidarity costs, how much support costs, how much a common policy costs, how much being a good European costs when one's own voters are poorer, angrier, and less willing to tolerate sacrifice. That is when the unraveling begins. At first, it is informal, then political, then economic, then institutional. One government blocks a decision, another demands exceptions for itself. A third one tries to protect its own energy base first. A fourth starts quietly bargaining with external powers for advantage. A fifth continues speaking the language of values, but no longer with the same force. At that point, the union may remain formally intact, but inside, it starts to resemble not a common strategic project, but a constant bargaining arena between tired, irritated, and differently vulnerable states. That is most likely what will happen to Europe. Now, mass poverty. This is another thing many people still underestimate, because the word poverty is usually associated either with actual famine or with chronically poor countries that seem to have always been that way. But the coming years are dangerous in another way, not because famine suddenly appears everywhere, but because the zone in which ordinary life becomes less and less affordable begins to expand. Expensive food, expensive energy, expensive transport, expensive rent, expensive credit, expensive security, expensive medicine, expensive normal life. So poverty is likely to grow not only in places where people are already on the edge, it will grow in places where people once believed themselves to be a stable middle class. And that is especially dangerous because the middle class is usually the group that takes the longest to believe that old guarantees no longer work. It holds on to the old picture of the world for as long as possible. And that is exactly why it often notices too late that not only comfort has been lost, but the very foundation of stable life. When that happens on a large scale, society becomes much angrier. A poor person is not dangerous simply because poverty automatically makes them aggressive. The danger is that a constant sense of loss, unfairness, instability, and helplessness makes people far more vulnerable to radical ideas, to enemy narratives, to simple answers, and to hard politics. That is why rising poverty almost never affects only the wallet. It affects the psychology of society. It makes society less tolerant, less rational, more nervous, and more willing to support those who promise a simple and violent resolution. Now, another crucial point. Stock markets, crypto, and the whole polished financial superstructure of the modern world also begin to look very different under these conditions. As long as the world remains relatively stable, people can keep playing with digital myths, with beautiful stories about a new economy, decentralization, future assets, and all the other fantasies that flourish in an age of cheap money. But in a truly hard world, people rediscover a much older truth very quickly. In moments of real fear, what matters is not a beautiful story, but liquidity and physical usefulness. That is why, in a severe phase of global crisis, financial markets are likely to remain under heavy pressure, not because every company suddenly becomes worthless, but because expensive energy, expensive credit, wars, weak logistics, inflation, internal fragmentation, and fear do not create a climate for calm growth. They create a climate for fleeing risk. And when people flee risk, almost everything that used to look like a clever investment begins to fall beautifully and brutally. The same applies even more strongly to cryptocurrencies. Yes, they are often marketed as a shelter from the collapse of the old system, something independent, modern, and free. But in a real hard crisis, crypto is very unlikely to behave like a safe haven. It is much more likely to behave like a risk asset. Because when the world genuinely starts shaking, people do not run into elegant digital myths. They run into whatever can be used quickly, exchanged quickly, and turned into physical safety quickly. And that is why, in a severe scenario, the crypto market is likely not to save anyone. On the contrary, it may become one of the clearest demonstrations of how quickly illusions disappear when real fear arrives. Now, culture, sport, and everything else people are used to calling normal life. In a crisis world, the first thing to shrink is not the army and not the coercive apparatus. The first thing to shrink is everything considered secondary: culture, education, civil projects, science without direct military use, the humanities, sport as a public good rather than as spectacle or propaganda. In other words, everything that makes a society not merely surviving, but alive. That matters enormously. The degradation of culture and sport is not a minor detail. It is a sign that both state and society are entering a mode in which development, creativity, and inner quality of life are pushed aside by control, security, resources, emergency management, and the simple effort to keep the system afloat. In such a mode, society becomes rougher. It becomes less subtle, less free, and less human. And this too is part of the coming crisis that people still underestimate. Now, law. Here, too many people still hold on to a very dangerous illusion. They believe that as long as parliaments, courts, constitutions, and elections continue to exist formally, the legal order remains basically intact. But the real problem is not paper. The real problem is how paper functions under pressure. And under pressure, law almost always begins to yield to expediency, to exceptions, to emergency measures, to circumvention, to administrative brutality, to the idea that this is necessary right now. And this is a dangerous process because it rarely looks like the open abolition of law. Much more often, it looks like the slow weakening of its force. Formally, everything remains in place. But in reality, the exception starts to matter more than the norm. Necessity matters more than principle. Fear or short-term advantage matters more than legal coherence. That is why law is likely to function more weakly almost everywhere in the coming years. In some places through authoritarian drift, in others through permanent emergency logic, in others through political bargaining, in others through the corrosion of trust, in still others through a direct turn toward the logic of force. The law does not have to vanish in order to fail people. It only has to bend often enough. And for the ordinary person, that means something very simple and very ugly. Fewer guarantees, less protection, less predictability. And this may be one of the hardest truths in the entire forecast. The problem of the coming years is not only war, expensive food, expensive energy, and mass poverty. The problem is that the familiar frame of the world itself, law, markets, alliances, stability, civility, predictability, ordinary daily life, begins slowly but very really to lose its shape. For too long, people have lived inside a system where even with all its flaws, there was still a basic feeling that the world in general held together. That somewhere there was a frame, somewhere there was a grown-up force that would not allow everything to fall apart completely. Somewhere there were rules that would eventually work. Somewhere there were allies who would not betray the structure itself. Somewhere there was a market that would fix the imbalance. Somewhere there was still a state that was, in the end, obliged to protect the citizen. That confidence is what is now eroding. Not completely, not equally everywhere, but systemically. And if this is not stopped, then the real question of the coming years is no longer whether a new global crisis will appear. It is already here. The question is how deeply it will redraw the map of the world, the behavior of states, the structure of alliances, and the everyday life of ordinary people. And after that, only one final question remains. What are people supposed to do inside such a world? Not states, not elites, not those who profit from chaos, but ordinary people who will have to live inside this breakdown. That is where we go next. And now we come to the most important question of all. Not what states will do, not how elites will maneuver, not how those who profit from chaos, fear, war, and poverty will try to benefit, but what ordinary people are actually supposed to do when the familiar world begins to lose its shape. Because in moments like this, most people fall into two equally destructive reactions. The first is panic. The second is denial. Some people begin to see the end of the world in every headline, lose the ability to think clearly, fall apart internally, and waste their strength not on action, but on endlessly chewing over fear. Others retreat into a dull psychological defense, and keep repeating that everything will somehow work out, that this has all happened before, that it is exaggerated, that it will not really touch them, that the main thing is simply not to think about it too much. Panic paralyzes, denial sedates, and reality punishes both. So the first thing to understand is this: in a harder world, the main task of an ordinary person is not to become either hysterical or asleep. What is needed is sobriety. Sobriety is not pessimism. Sobriety is not darkness for the sake of darkness. Sobriety is the ability to look at an unpleasant reality without self deception and without falling apart inside. If the world is entering a more expensive and more dangerous phase, then that has to be admitted. If states are weakening, that has to be admitted. If food, energy, law, logistics, and security are becoming less guaranteed, that has to be admitted. Not in order to become frightened, but in order to stop living psychologically as if one were still inside yesterday's world. The second thing is this: people must stop waiting for a savior. That era is ending. Weak elites will not save you. Overloaded states will not save you in the way you used to imagine. International structures will not save you. The market will not save you. Beautiful rhetoric will not save you. No system that is itself already living under pressure will place your personal resilience above its own struggle for self-preservation. This is an unpleasant thought, but it is exactly where an adult position begins. As long as a person remains psychologically a child who expects someone wiser and stronger above them to fix everything, that person is already losing. Because in a harder world, the people who do best are not the ones who complain the loudest or outrage the most. The people who do best are the ones who accept the new reality earlier than others and begin to act inside it soberly. What does that mean in practical terms? It means returning to basic things that were considered automatic for too long: food, water, medicine, heat, communication, documents, cash or quickly accessible liquidity, a minimum level of autonomy, a clear understanding of where to go, whom to call, and what to do if the system starts functioning worse. It is very important to understand that this is not paranoia and not some romantic fantasy of survivalism. It is simply a return to common sense. If the world is becoming less reliable, then the value of simple things rises again, not metaphorically, but directly. The ability to keep reserves of water, food, medicine, light, charging, warmth, copies of documents, and means of communication is no longer excessive anxiety. It is a normal form of insurance in a world where large systems no longer look unbreakable. And then comes what may be the most important part. People have to stop being isolated. Because in a softer world, an isolated individual can live for a very long time inside the illusion of self-sufficiency. They can order everything with delivery. They can buy solutions through services, institutions, the market, and the state. They can imagine that other people mostly interfere with life. But in a harsher world, the isolated person begins to lose faster. Every serious disruption reveals the same truth. One person may be intelligent, strong, disciplined, and prepared, but their time, attention, physical strength, and resources are still limited. That is why unity between people is no longer a moral slogan or a beautiful idea for peaceful times. It becomes a question of survival, where people know how to cooperate, help one another, stay in contact, exchange resources, information, transport, warmth, food, skills, and support. The chances of getting through a hard period are much higher. Where everyone is alone, the system breaks people one by one. This has to be understood very clearly. In the coming years, what will matter is not only money, what will matter is connection. Reliable people, proven people, people with whom one can do more than just talk, people with whom one can get through outages, relocation, winter, shortages, expensive food, stress, and exhaustion. So, the main social resource of the coming years is not the crowd. It is not followers. It is not a virtual feeling of togetherness. It is real human networks. From there follows another necessity. People need to rebuild their lives for a harder world. That means asking difficult but necessary questions. How dependent am I on a single source of income? How dependent am I on a single energy system? How dependent am I on one city, one supply chain, one way of life? Do I have reserves of food, water, health, documents, and communication? Do I have people I can really rely on? Do I have a place where survivability is higher? Do I have skills that remain useful in crisis and not only in comfort? These are uncomfortable questions, but they are still better than meeting reality too late, when there is no time left to ask them properly. There is one more layer, and without it, everything else falls apart: mental structure. Because the deepest shortage of the coming years may not be only energy or food, it may be adequacy itself. Huge numbers of people will fall into hysteria, denial, hatred, or blind faith in another loud savior. And all of those states make a person easier to manipulate. This is exactly where the foundation of adequatism becomes critical: the ability to separate fact from interpretation, to look at reality without beautiful lies, to withstand unpleasant truth, and not to react to every blow as if it were the end of everything. If a person cannot do that, then every crisis will break them twice: first through reality itself, and then through their own mind. That means that the coming years will demand especially strongly observation, internal discipline, emotional steadiness, the refusal to believe the first convenient version of events, the ability to distinguish noise from real threat, and the ability to act without hysteria. At the same time, people need to accept that comfort leaves first, not in order to suffer theatrically, but in order not to enter shock when comfort stops being the natural background of life. In the coming years, the world will most likely become more expensive, harsher, and less convenient. Some services will disappear. Some processes will become slower. Some systems will become less reliable. Some things will cost much more. Some parts of life will have to be abandoned or rebuilt, not because people want change, but because the old model will no longer function the way it once did. This is where many people break, not because of the threat itself, but because they lose the psychological entitlement to comfort. They feel that if life is no longer convenient, then the world must already be ruined. No, it only means the world has become harder. And then one either adapts and strengthens oneself, or continues living like a person from the old era, only to be crushed by the new one. And one final thing matters just as much: people need to preserve what is human. That sounds soft, but in reality, it is very hard. Because hard times make people coarser very easily. They become angrier, more cynical, more primitive, more aggressive. They start to justify cruelty, betrayal, manipulation, internal hardening, and moral ugliness much faster. But that too is a form of collapse. It has to be understood clearly. To survive physically while disintegrating inwardly is also a form of defeat. If a person passes through a hard period only by losing conscience, trust, compassion, the ability to unite, and the ability to remain human, then that person does not come out as a victor. They come out as a fragment. That is why preserving an inner core is not an abstract moral luxury. It is part of resilience itself. Wherever people completely lose the human dimension, society begins to collapse not only economically, but in its essence. So the final conclusion is simple. The next 3 years will most likely be far harder than many people still want to believe. The world will become more expensive. Energy will become more nervous. Food will become more sensitive. Politics will become rougher. Law will become weaker. Alliances will become less reliable. Familiar comfort will become less accessible. And many people will experience all of this not as geopolitics, but as their own exhaustion, their own anxiety, their own bills, and their own struggle with the future. But that still does not mean that everyone is doomed. It means something else. The people who are most likely to pass through this period better are not the loudest, not the most self confident, and not necessarily the richest. The people who will do better are those who know how to see reality soberly, unite, build autonomy, avoid total dependence on one fragile system, endure pain without falling apart, and refuse to place their lives entirely in the hands of degrading institutions. So, the main question of the coming years is not whether things will become difficult. Things will almost certainly become difficult. The real question is different. Who will be ready? Who will understand earlier than others that the old world is ending? Who will adapt? Who will unite? And who will remain human when the familiar form of the world begins to fall away? Because if people continue waiting for saviors, living inside self deception, tearing one another apart, denying the obvious, and hoping that someone above will solve everything, then the world really will enter a very dark phase. But if at least some people begin to think clearly, unite, and act soberly, then even through a hard period, humanity will still have a chance to move not into total destruction, but into a painful and difficult renewal. So now the question is no longer whether there will be a crisis. The question is who will pass through it as a victim, and who will pass through it as a person who understood reality earlier than others and prepared in time.